Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our book conversation with Dr. Sue Stein, who will discuss her book, The Distant Service. My name is Bauman Bakhtiari. I'm Executive Director of the Basketball Institute. We are pleased to have you join us for our fall program 2022. As many of you know, in early September, we had arranged for a panel discussion on U.S.-Iran relations with the late Professor John Tierman, his colleagues Malcolm Byrne, and Professor Banoy of Indiana University. Unfortunately, Professor Tierman passed away suddenly, and we had to postpone that event to December. We would like to send our deepest condolences to Professor Tierman's family, colleagues, and friends. Professor Tierman had a distinguished career of publishing books and articles on U.S.-Iran relations, which also is a topic of our discussion today. So we will reschedule that talk. And another announcement that I have for everyone is that in November, we will host a book launch with Ambassador John Limbert and Ambassador Mark Grossman on their novel called Believers. And we have translated that into Persian. So we will launch the Persian translation of that book in November, making it available on our social media live platforms for people to read and learn about the fantastic fictional work that these both ambassadors have done. So today we have invited Dr. Sue Stein, who many of you know from our previous engagements. She is an author of a book called The Distant Service. It's the story of a American diplomat who had a very, very interesting, notorious background, who was assigned to Persia in 1923, if I can remember, and then his life ended with an assassination in July. Dr. Sue Stein has provided a fantastic background about this gentleman, William Imbrie, who he was, how he got assigned to Persia. And in that context, she has also given us a really fantastic picture of Persia, Iran at that time, the politics in that country, great powers, the struggle for influence. So we are very pleased to have her join us. She has a PhD in English. She served as a columnist, journalist for the Omaha Herald for 15 years. She has experience teaching secondary, post-secondary, and she has been an avid observer of Iran, Iranian history. I always mention to her that she definitely has an A+ for attending our seminars all the time. So without taking much from her time, please join us in welcoming Dr. Sue Stein.
Thank you. I do want to share my PowerPoint. If we can take a minute to pull that up. First of all, I would like to thank the Baskerville Institute, particularly Professor Bakhtiari, for inviting me to be included in the 2022-23 series. The Baskerville Institute seeks to encourage friendship among Americans and Iranians and create a better understanding of our shared history, and I hope I can contribute to that mission today. I would like to start with just a referral to Howard Baskerville. I know Reza Aslan's book is coming out, his biography in October, which is wonderful. Baskerville was born in Nebraska, and I'm zooming from Nebraska. Nebraska is a large state. It could fit all of New England in it. So I'm on the east end. Baskerville was born in the far west, but he did come to Omaha for college. Bellevue College is no longer in existence. We do have a Bellevue University, but they're not related. At any rate, we have a little bit of a connection. Robert Imbrie, Robert Imbrie was, lived from 1883 to 1924. And here he's depicted in his college graduation picture from George Washington University. He went to Yale's law school, graduated in 1906, and then went to the Legal Aid Society, working for the Siemens branch. So a very social justice issue interest at the beginning of his career. And after that, he went to Baltimore. He opened up a private practice. His specialty was admiralty law. And this is the home where he lived. He had been orphaned and in 1897. And this was his uncle and aunt's home. And he claimed this as his home until the day he died. The building is still there in DC, and it's now an office building. Last time I checked, it was an office building. He traveled extensively. One of his trips, he went to Europe, he went to Western US. One of his trips was with Richard Garner, who had a safari to Gabon, and Imbrie went with him. Garner was a curious person, kind of a pseudoscientist, and he thought he could learn to talk to gorillas. And here he is observing gorillas in a cage. And of course, we're wondering who's observing whom. When war broke out, Imbrie closed up his law practice, and he went to volunteer in the American Field Service. And he was an ambulance driver for the American Field Service, one of the longest serving volunteer ambulance drivers, 17 months. And he served in France. This is his passport picture from that time. He looks pretty serious about what he's about to undertake. And he served in France at the Battle of Verdun. The Battle of Verdun, and he was then transferred to the Army of the Orient. And at the time, the Orient meant Macedonia, the Balkans, Greece, and so on. So he was mostly in a very mountainous region, having been in the trenches in France. This was a very different war. When the U.S. entered the war, Imbrie was 34 years old, so that's beyond his age of being drafted. He tried to get in. He was 34. But instead, he went into the State Department. He had been recovering from a really serious bout of typhus, so there was a health issue too. He arrived in Russia, in St. Petersburg, just as the Russian Revolution began. So when we're looking at his career, we see him going from war to war to war to war zone. And it's only when he gets to Persia that he's actually out of a war zone. In St. Petersburg, as you may recall, he would have been there when Russia and Germany signed a treaty. So the Americans and the Allies moved north. They didn't want to be arrested in St. Petersburg. But Imbrie was sent back in April of 1918, and he was there until August 1918. And what he was trying to do was to protect Americans who were living there. Some of them had been put in the Peter and Paul fortress in the prison. And here is a cartoon of him, and he is demanding of the head of the Cheka, Moses Uitsky, to release some Americans. And he was also in charge of, it's really a big spread out city, isn't it? He's in charge of all the material that's been left behind that the Americans are responsible for. So it would be food, and it would also be munitions. And the concern, of course, was this would fall to the Germans, and we didn't want that happening. Occasionally, he had to flee to the city to go to Strelina, which is on the left of your screen. But eventually, the Norwegian embassy notified him that he was going to be arrested the next day, and they would pick him up with false papers, flying Norwegian flags, and get him to the train and out of the country. And that's what happened. And he went to the top of your screen, you'll see the city of Viborg, and it's now a Russian city, but at the time it was Finnish. And so the next place he was posted was in Viborg, Finland. And he again was doing information gathering. He didn't regard it as spying. His friend Admiral Halsey, who some of you may know from the conclusion of World War II, was vehement about the fact that he was an information gatherer in Germany before World War II. He was not a spy. Imbrie had a map of his reconnaissance service. So he had agents going in and out of Revel to Petrograd and taking information to Moscow. He also was working strenuously with the food issue because there was such concern about hunger after the war. And as you can see, it was a desperate situation. So he also was overseeing tons of food. The White Army was fighting the Red or Bolshevik Army, and he was also overseeing what was happening with those two armies. When the White Army collapsed in the northwest of Russia, he went to Turkey, and he had hoped to go to Crimea and follow the southwest arm of the White Army. The Bolsheviks, the Red Army, defeated that army before he got there. So he spent the first posting in Constantinople. He didn't find it very satisfactory. But the second posting, he was the lone observer to the new government of Turkey at the new capital of Turkey. So he was sent to Ankara. And I put this map on so you could see Turkey in the dark red, burgundy. Imbrie went all around the Black Sea, Batun, and so on, reconnoitering, went as far as Greece. And while he was on these trips, he was often just by himself with a translator and maybe a guide. This picture was one that he had taken for an article he was writing for the National Geographic. It appeared in October 1924, a month after his stateside funeral. While he was in Ankara, he met his future wife. She had been with the Near East Relief for 5 years, and she was taking care of Armenian and Greek orphans. And at one point, she conducted 7,000 orphans to an orphanage in Alexandropol, pictured here. And there were 30,000 orphans in the city living in former Russian barracks. It was called rightfully the Orphan City. And after Catherine and Robert married, they took in some Armenian orphans and so on. When there was a conclusion concerning an oil concession in Turkey, and that then made Imbrie an ideal candidate to go to Persia, where there was a great struggle going on over who would control oil. And he also knew the politics of Russia and some of the politics, of course, of Great Britain. That wasn't such a concern. But having somebody on site who understood what was going on with the Bolsheviks was important. So he was assigned to Persia. He was assigned to Tabriz, but right before he and Catherine got there, the consul, Bernard Gottlieb, in Tehran said he wanted to take a vacation. And so Robert was assigned to Tehran, and it was, of course, a fateful assignment. He never made it to Tabriz. Persia at the time was struggling for its self-identity. And I put this map up because it captures the British Empire in pink and how extensive it was in the area. It also shows in purple the threat of Soviet Russia. And of course, then Persia is striped in pink and purple. So who is going to get to control Persia? Are the Persians going to get to control their own country? There were three conflicts that I focus on for Imbrie's story when he arrived. The commercial conflict over the oil interests in particular, the US represented by Standard Oil and Sinclair Oil, and Great Britain by Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And then there was Russia, who had given up all its concessions under the Bolsheviks, except for one, that I think we'll talk about later. But Standard Oil was aligned with Great Britain, with APOC. Sinclair was on its own. There were also political issues. What was Persia going to be? Would it continue as a monarchy? Would it be a theocracy? Would it be a republic? And then there was religious conflict when Imbrie arrived. And so his first three reports were on these three areas. And if we're looking at this slide, you can see on the right, Royal Dutch was a predecessor of APOC, Anglo-Persian, and cozying up to Standard Oil. And then on the left is Ralph Soper, who was the Sinclair Oil representative in Tehran and became a great friend of Imbrie's. Imbrie made friends very easily and from all walks of life. And Soper was an engineering grantor from Stanford University, very highly thought of. And so Soper, in representing Sinclair Oil, had an edge over Standard Oil and APOC because the Persian parliament, the Majlis, had passed a law that they would only deal with an American company and it could not have ties to other foreign companies. So it looked like everything was going to go rather well with Sinclair, and they had joined negotiations with Russia to move that oil not to the south using British pipelines, but hopefully to the north, establishing pipelines there. One other thing that's important in Imbrie's story is the finance mission of Arthur Millspot, an American who was sent over there with a team to modernize the treasury, the way you write a budget, the financial situation, so Persia could become independent and not rely on foreign loans. He was not a very diplomatic person, and I think that contributed to his struggles in his position. He was there though till 1927, but when the contract ended, Reza Khan did not renew it. I'd like to look at the religious conflicts at some depth here because it's so important in the atmosphere that Imbrie encountered. Joseph Kornfeld was the first Jewish US ambassador in our history. And I think that he was assigned to Persia for very specific reasons. religious reasons. And the Jews had been living under, for a long time, they had been living under very difficult situations. There had been pogroms in 1865, 1888, 1889, and Kornfeld himself stopped one in 1922. But the restrictions are, there's just so many of them. So I won't go into all of them, of course. They had to wear a fez rather than the cooler turban. You know, so some things were very small. Other things were very large. They were forbidden to have shops and bazaars. The oath of a Jew in court was not accepted. If a Jew became a Muslim, his property then, all the family property went to him, and it did not go to his descendants. So it was a very difficult time. Also, there was a great deal of food insecurity, and in 1918, there was a report that said about 25% of the Jews in Persia were suffering from food insecurity, they were suffering starvation. Before and after World War I, the international community wanted Persia to rethink its attitude to Jews, because Persia wanted to be part of the world trade climate. And so there were, like the Shah, when the Shah visited Europe, very prominent Jews, including the Rothschilds, signaled to him that there had to be changes made. So I think that's one thing that prompted Kornfeld's appointment. Another thing, though, was this anti-Semitic protocols of the learned elders of Zion. And it was fraudulent. It was proven to be, there was a huge page in the New York Times with all these prominent people, including the president and past presidents signing it and saying this is really horrible. Henry Ford himself did not disavow it for a long time. So I think it was a way for Warren Harding to signal that there had to be a change of attitude about Jews, not only in Persia, but in the US. And in writing Imbrie's book, it's really painful to read some of the State Department missives that are either subtle biases against Jews or overtly anti-Semitic. And Catherine Imbrie, unfortunately, when she attacks Kornfeld for what she regards as his poor investigation of her husband's death, does it sometimes in anti-Semitic terms. It's very unfortunate. Another religion of concern at the time, another minority in Persia, were the Baha'is. And a little background, in 1820, Sayyid Ali Muhammad had founded a reform meeting proclaiming himself as the Bab, or gate to God, but it was seen as heretical to Islamists. And he was arrested, he was executed in Tabriz in 1850, but under his disciples, Bahaism became a worldwide religion. And in the slide I'm showing you, Abdul Baha came to Europe, he came to the US, and he visited many places spreading this message of peace and brotherhood as the world was veering towards war. So it's a very attractive message, and people were open to hearing it because of the threat of war. And for our story, one important Baha'i is Dr. Susan Moody, who served in Persia for a long period of time. She had a clinic, medical clinic, She opened a school. She had 300 girls. She worked in hospitals, and she went to Imbrie, and after he arrived, and she said that there was a Black Hand Committee. It had marked her for death. They were going to kill her. Part of the payment had already been made. He went to the police chief. He was able to protect her. Nothing happened to her. It really frightened her, though. And she felt that he had staged what she called a Holocaust of blood. You'll see that she leaves in 1924. She's been there from 1909 to 1924. But she's so shaken by this that she goes back to the States for a while, despite her long history in Persia. And then the last minority religion we want to look at, and has been looked at a number of times by the Baskerville Institute, are the Presbyterian medical missionaries. There were other Christians as well at the time. Their mission was medical, educational. It was not evangelizing except to other Christian segments such as Assyrian, Chaldean, and Armenian Christians. And it's interesting that the first person to go and get help for Imbrie was a Chaldean Christian. There were Baptists and Anglicans and Catholics and Russian Orthodox. But I'm zeroing in today because Dr. Packard and his wife Frances became such good friends in such a short time. It's really amazing when you look that he was only there from May until July, and he made so many firm friends. And the night before his death, or the day before his death, the Packards and Imbries went on a picnic. And at that evening, when the Packards dropped Catherine and Bob off at the consulate, they already had plans for another picnic at the next full moon on August 14th. Unfortunately, that day began the trials of the people accused of killing Imbrie. Packard was the person who came to treat Imbrie in the hospital after he was attacked. And the next day, he performed the autopsy. There was also political turmoil. As many of you know, Reza Khan was the Minister of War at the time. He was also Prime Minister. He had had a dramatic rise in power from 1921 on. He was in conflict with the Majlis. He thought at first he could establish a republic. He admired Mustafa Kemal in Turkey. There was a republic there, but he was unable to win the Majlis over his. At the beginning of 1924, his power was actually slipping. So he visited with Ayatollahs, and they said that according to their religion, you could not have a republic. So he came back with the thought that he would, I mean, I don't have documentation for this, but seeing how history played out, he was not going to give the mullahs power. He was going to take it. So it was going to be a dictatorship. And he did, in fact, become Shah and started the Pahlavi dynasty, as we shall see. So this was the situation when Imbrie was killed. Oh, before I go on, I'll just mention Hassan Madoris, who was a cleric and a member of the parliament, and probably the most significant opponent to Reza Khan. And after Reza Khan's rise to power, they were able to work together for a little while, but not long, and he eventually went into house arrest for many, many years. And the suspicion is that he was poisoned, and that's how he died. This is a map of Tehran from about this period. It might be off 1 or 2 years or so. But on the day of Imbrie's death, he went with a man who was under house arrest at the consulate. He was an oil roustabout, and Imbrie thought he had been ill-treated by the consul Gottlieb and was trying to get his conviction overturned. He was worried that he was suffering from depression, and so he was taking him out to the barber and the bazaar, and they had gone out any number of times. And they go to the bazaar, which is at the bottom of your screen, and Imbrie has a camera. If we get a chance, we'll talk about his photography. And he was a avid photographer and what we would call a photojournalist today. At any rate, he takes out his camera, somebody yells at him, says he's a Baha'i, he's taking pictures of women to sell in Europe, and all of a sudden there's a mob chasing them. They jump in a car, and Imbrie, if you follow the bursts of orange color going from south to north, that is the European street. So it would have been modern and it would have been safe. Or much safer than what they encountered. Instead, they bore a little to the left on the screen, and they get up to the parade grounds with the light blue arrow. The two men are pulled out of the vehicle. They're separated, and Imbrie's on his own, badly beaten. His roustabout friend is also very badly beaten. And finally, and you'll see the orange arrow is at the Cossack barricades or barracks. They are taken by police finally to the police hospital, but then the mob breaks in there and finishes them off. Packard is alerted by this Chaldean Christian who was his servant, his steward, and he gets to the hospital. He's not able to save Imbrie, and Imbrie dies at 3 p.m. The story is told all over the world, and from China to California, London, Moscow, Italy. And it's not just a one-day headline. It's a continuing story. And so it catches people's attention. Imbrie had heard that 2 or 3 foreigners would be killed around the beginning of August. It never entered anybody's mind that a foreign service officer would be killed. And in fact, Imbrie is talking with Packard at that picnic, and he said, it's really nice to be in a safe city. So I'm putting rapidly some of these pictures of his funeral or the transport of the body. He had a funeral service. Beethoven's March was played. It was quite a service. And then his body was taken to Basra, and he is put on the USS Trenton, which is the first US warship to be in the Persian Gulf. And it was on its maiden voyage and available. So that will bring him home. And there's quite a bit of pomp and circumstance in regard to this funeral. And the reason I'm putting these pictures on is that they are rarely reproduced. Some of them are in the Library of Congress, but others are in Imbrie's file, so not easily accessible to most people. When he gets to New York, or when he gets to Washington, D.C., the body gets there. It's moved then off the ship and taken to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, which was Abraham Lincoln's church. And there's a Lincoln pew there. Lincoln's eulogy was read there. President and Mrs. Coolidge sit in Lincoln's pew for Imbrie's service. He's then buried in Arlington National Cemetery. So what's going on back in Tehran? Well, Wallace Smith Murray is put in charge of the investigation. Kornfeld had put in his resignation in January, had planned to leave in June, stayed a little bit longer, wasn't there for a long time. And he didn't have a lot to do with the investigation. He did some depositions and that kind of thing, but he didn't have the skills for a murder investigation. Major Sherman Miles had had a long stint of investigatory activities for the military, and he was in Constantinople when this happened and came immediately. And Catherine Imbrie thought he was just wonderful and very reliable. She wasn't always so sure about Murray. Murray eventually became the first ambassador to modern Iran. The US made 5 demands, and generally we can say the bottom 4 were adhered to. Catherine quibbled about the honors, but I don't think that was so serious. The first one, adequate reparation and prompt punishment for the killers and those who allowed the attacks to occur, is never met. So even to today. And so we go back here just for a minute to explain what does happen. 3 young men are tried, they're executed. It's a drawn out process. They even have Packard do a physical examination of one youth to be sure that he's old enough. They figure he's 16, he's old enough, and people in the Orient mature more quickly than those in the West. So he's executed. Nobody who was, in my mind, and there is no smoking gun, I'll be very frank about that. This is all a matter of looking through documents and drawing the best conclusion I can. Unfortunately, Imbrie's diary was destroyed. That diary went from 1906 to 1924, and his wife had it destroyed on her death. So we might have much more if that hadn't happened. And maybe it'll show up somewhere. You know, we can always hope that some lawyer didn't follow through on what he was supposed to do. I don't know if that's right. I hope that, but as a writer, I hope that. At any rate, the people who were really, as far as Wallace, as far as Murray was concerned, the people who were in charge of the investigation and the trial were the ones who were responsible for what happened. And so he sees the whole trial business as just a sop. And what is unfortunate, I think, for his reputation is that he, I want to say, well, he insists, even though he knows these young people are not guilty of what happened, he insists on their execution, and that's really, again, painful to read about, that the way he saw it. Okay, so who was guilty? And nobody was executed for his death. I think that's really important. These three young men are executed for like not obeying orders, but nobody is executed for killing Imbrie. So was it Russia? And I think one of the things that when I give a presentation that people really want to conclusion is, who did it? It's a whodunit kind of thing. And we can only consider what's provided. And Russia wanted control of the Caspian Seas, and sturgeon caviar was black gold. And I don't think they would have disrupted those negotiations with this turmoil. The US had not recognized the Bolshevik government, even though relations had improved in 1920, 1922, 24. Things were getting better because the US business community was pushing the government to recognize the Bolshevik government, and trade had improved. I don't think they jeopardized it. Imbrie had been tried in absentia in 1919 in Russia, condemned to death, but Russia could have had him killed at any time between then and 1924 and in many, many places, and they haven't bothered with it. US officials in Tehran did not blame Russia. And I think it's important to look at people on the ground. What do they think, as opposed to what do people in the State Department back here think, especially in this day and age when communication was so slow. And also when Persia seemed exotic. And I think sometimes people actually look down on Persians as somehow not as civilized as they are. And I think that feeds into the relationships. And also Russia was working with Sinclair Oil, and the concession was due out of the Majlis, out of the parliament on July 20th. And Imbrie dies on the 18th. There's some really key dates that have come up in the research. So did Great Britain do it? They were another one that people considered. And in 1919, Lord Curzon, who's the foreign minister, Curzon, he had called for Persia to be a protectorate, and that created a huge backlash. So I don't think they would want to upset things too much. The Great Britain already had a reputation for wanting to control the Middle East, and it didn't need further sullying. It wanted the opium trade controlled. The opium trade was huge. Mills Pa was hoping to use it for tariff, for taxes. There was one shipment of opium, it had 150 horsemen guarding it. It was not little packages passing here and there. It's huge business. And so the British and the Americans were hoping to work together on this. And also APOC was working with an American company, Standard Oil. So doesn't seem that they would do this. How about Reza Khan? And I do, right up front, I do settle on him. The US delegation in Tehran thought the murder, immediately they thought the murder was political and the trial a sham. On July 17th, the day before Imbrie's killed, Mills Pa threatens to reduce Reza Khan's military budget. And the main reason that Reza Khan is hanging on to power is because of that, that military budget. And so he doesn't want that to happen. And of course, that whole thing gets shelved in the turmoil after Imbrie's death. I already mentioned how he had lost power and how he needed to come back in his mind in a strong way. He immediately declares martial law, and that is in place for well over a year. So some people want to blame Imbrie, and he brought a camera to the bazaar, And I think this is a little bit of bias against the Persians, as though, again, primitive people wouldn't know about cameras. But the longest reigning Shah of the Qajar dynasty was a great patron of photography. He had 3 court photographers, he had developing places in the palace. Francis Packard was a photographer, as was Vice Consul Greg Fuller, who came in to help with the investigation, realizing that if Imbrie hadn't been appointed to Tehran, he probably would have been. Imbrie's friend in Turkey, who was an engineer, had been Armenians. His name was Louis Davis. He attested to Imbrie's caution in photographing people, saying how respectful he was. And then the National Geographic had published a photographic story on Persia, I think in 1922. And so people were used to that. And then I also want to mention Marion Cooper and Ernest Schoensack. They had just come from filming making a film called Grass, Bakhtiari, people moving their flocks from mountains to pastures, and a huge undertaking. This movie Grass is right up there on the scale with Nanook of the North as far as an important movie. It's online, you can watch it. These 2 men came, I think they were probably Imbrie's last house guests. They came to have him sign an affidavit about the film, and that affidavit is at the end of the movie. So keeping Imbrie's name in front of people well into the 1925, 1926. And then, of course, in 1933, these 2 make the movie King Kong, which is, they're better known for that than for Grass. And then on the way to, I'll back up a little bit, Forbes Lee was going to drive from Leeds, England to India. And he was going to take pictures and film it. He gets to Kermanshah, he has to stop his car because Imbrie's cortege has precedent on the roads. He gets to Tehran, and this is a picture of him and his car in front of the barracks where Imbrie was assaulted. And I put in the Felix the Cat because that was Ford Lee's mascot at the time. And there's reference to it in the records. I know there's an effort being made to make a documentary on Forbes Lee, but there's so little film available. Imbrie is also sometimes accused of being reckless, an adventurer, a spy. And so I really wanted to leave you with this quote from G. Howland Smith. Adventuresomeness is not irresponsibility or vague bondage. It's a zest for living and learning, a constructive discontent and restlessness, an impatient desire to grow. And so, and I think that captures Imbrie well. So I think I'll turn it back and end my show here.
Very much. If you, I think your screen share is still on.
Okay, and yeah, let me get off of that.
Right. Well, thank you so much.
Questions, of course.
Thank you so much for that really informative presentation. And it is so much in our interest when it comes to Persia, Persian history, American-Iranian relations, to really connect all the dots before any conclusions, as you know. So I'd like to start with a couple of questions about your book. I've read it, really enjoyed the pre-Imbrie travel to Persia much more. Actually, I thought the book has much more about Imbrie before going to Persia. And then the other part of the book that our audience and members could be find very interesting is really the question of the political actors and who benefited from Imbrie's death. I mean, you outlined some of the suspects here, but I think it's also interesting for audience to know the question, as an author, researcher, you have now seen the documents, everything. Who do you think benefited the most from his death? I mean, does it make sense to, for example, look at some of the documents on Reza Khan before becoming Reza Shah? You talk a little bit. Could one say the person that benefited the most from this was Reza Khan or Great Britain, Russia? So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, to me it does. I don't think it would have benefited Russia much at all. They were in a pretty vulnerable state as far as the relationship with the US, and they really were in economic dire straits, and they needed US trade. And so I don't think it would have benefited them. And very similarly, Britain. And those are the main culprits that are listed alongside Reza Khan. And Reza Khan uses this. I mean, as soon as he declares martial law, he has his foot in the door to be Shah. And he knows that. And he becomes a landowner that is, by 1932, I think it is, he's the largest landowner in Persia. And he just has enormous wealth. And when I'm reading the documents from the State Department, from officers who come after Imbrie, there's comment after comment about his rapaciousness, his greed, his unpredictability. They really paint him. And even though, sometimes you have to read these reports, with a grain of salt, is it rumor? Is it true? But there's so much that, one or two things might not have happened. Maybe he didn't beat up this chef, that kind of thing. But the preponderance of evidence just paints a very poor picture of him. And he does, and I think it was Murray said that he felt what Reza Khan really wanted to do was get an enormous wealth, put it in Swiss banks and banks in London, and that's what he was really interested in. So, yeah, I think it was Reza Khan.
Yeah, I think most historians will kind of agree with you in terms of how the post-assassination events unfolded. Another thing in your book that is interesting is about how you divide up the situation in Iran, Persia at that time, when Imbrie arrived. You are rightly putting it in terms of commercial, political, and religious.
Yes.
And as you were making that presentation, I was thinking about today's Iran. And is it really, if you were to look at the consequences for American-Iranian relations and the whole, how Americans have understood Iran or the Orientalist perspective about Persia, if you look at all of that, do you see a kind of continuity even today? When I finished reading your book, I couldn't really stop thinking about how many of these factors, actors, issues that you described could really be applicable to Iran today.
And, I thought of that too as I was writing the book, because it seemed that every day, or maybe it was every week, seemed like every day, there would be a headline or a story that would make me think, oh, this is just like 1924 or 1928. And I don't know if you will agree on this, but maybe you would have something to add to this. But it seemed to me that Reza Khan was such a force in that short period after Imbrie's death, I mean, it was just this golden opportunity for him, that he shuts off the mullahs and strips them of their power. And then we go into this monarchy of his, and the mullahs are left feeling that they did not get what they wanted. And I think that festered right up to 1979. And so I think that the US did not understand, well, they didn't understand Islam, that was for sure. They didn't know how to work with the Majlis. And of course, at this time, there's the rise of the strongman. Mussolini's already in power. Hitler is on the rise. Mustafa Kemal is kind of an interesting person, because even though he is he's a strong man in a sense, but when he dies, there's a cult of personality, but he's also left in place a functioning government. And I don't think that happens in Persia. And Reza Khan is more attracted to the strongman image that he sees happening in Europe, and so begins to align with Germany. And that really impacts US, Persian, Iranian relations. So, because that, you know, prior to World War II, we had not invaded Persia. You know, we did not have a standing army there. And it's kind of interesting to read some of the accounts, because some people say, well, why don't we just bomb Tehran? You know, and no sense of geography, you know, after Imbrie dies. But, you know, that was really in our favor. We were seen as not the enemy and possibly a great friend. But then after World War II, we had lost that neutrality. Now, I don't know if I answered you.
Yes, you did. You did. And I also like to kind of, for our members, and many of us are very interested in the situation of the Baha'is in Iran. And you also talked about in your book about how Imbrie was interested in the case of Dr. Moody and the American Baha'is. And then with that interest, he started exploring more in his presence in Tehran about anti-Baha'i activities, anti-Baha'i attacks, right? And then there was a story, I think Professor Zorinsky has written also extensively on it, that there was a story that there was this location, Saqqa-Khane in Tehran, that they will take the Baha'is to that place, the fountain. It was a fountain. And they will drink from that fountain. And if they had not repented their faith, they will go blind. And frequently they will come back and say, well, somebody gained his eyesight because he repented. And that kind of had kind of created that crowd activity, crowd mentality, right? The crowd mentality in politics is very important. So that was all taking place when Imbrie was on site before he was killed, right?
Yes.
Now, and all the documentations that I have seen shown that anti-Baha'i sentiments could be among the population, but when it becomes organized targeting, it is usually an element behind it.
Yes.
And what do you think of some of the historical observations that Reza Khan was the head of the Cossack brigade, and there was a Cossack brigade base near the location. And some of those historians have said Reza Khan's element actually promoted anti-Baha'i activities in order to blame the clerics.
So what is your question for me?
So my question is, could the anti-Baha'i attacks at that period also have been motivated by Reza Khan as part of his strategy on
yes.
repressing the religious leaders.
Yes, and I now there's some evidence that there might have been some British influence in terms of keeping things stirred up, but again, my documentation is much less helpful in that area.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that there were pogroms against Jews, there were mob attacks on Baha'is, somebody was trying to keep the cauldron boiling. And that would point, if I'm using logic, and that kind of is dangerous in history, not always, things are not always logical, but if I'm thinking of Reza Khan waiting for an opportunity, would it be enough to stir up a pogrom? Would it be enough to stir up Baha'i? And there were a number of these assaults on Baha'is. So, so maybe he just needed to up the ante more to create that opportunity. So, I mean, the Jews and the Baha'is are easy targets for him because they are small population-wise. And who's going to come to their defense? So, but it's not enough to get that crown.
Great. So we have a question from Professor Zurinsky, and I'm going to go ahead, Michael. You can unmute. So waiting for him to unmute. He had to raise his hand.
Could I add one more thing while we're waiting?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. You know, some people say that Imbrie was reckless going to the fountain area in the bazaar where there had been purportedly a miracle. The reports say, in some reports, that the place was full of spies, and you know, all kinds of people were there. People who were funding other people come, that kind of thing. And so, but I don't think Imbrie was being reckless. He wrote in Turkey that he wrote a note that he feels anxious now that he's married. And he seemed to be more cautious because of that. And Catherine is pregnant. And she loses that baby shortly after Imbrie's death. And she never has a child. And that figures into all the work she puts in to trying to bring what she figures is rightful justice for her husband, which continues to 1950. So do we have Michael yet?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Yes. Hello, Michael.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I'm being very klutzy here, and I inadvertently raised my hand without meaning to. But since you have me online, I have a question about the role of the State Department in this, and in particular, the role of Alan Dulles, who was then head of the Near Eastern Affairs Department, and who, of course, was head of CIA in 1953. So I wonder, Susan, if you see any connection between the two events.
Well, one event would, do you mean like how Dulles handled this, or?
Yeah.
You know, they were together in Turkey, and I have to be upfront. I'm not a fan of Alan Dulles. Imbrie was maybe about 10 years older or so, maybe a little more than Dulles. They were both in Constantinople at the same time, so they knew each other. Dulles thought that Imbrie, at one point, and I think you cited it in an article, that you thought, or that Dulles said, I can't remember if the word was impetuous, that he thought of Imbrie as maybe impetuous, but given the circumstances, a good person to send to Persia. And then in another missive, he's much more complimentary of Imbrie. I'm not sure, you know, and then Alan Dulles has just a terrible time with Catherine Imbrie. She drove him crazy with all her messages and letters and so on. She didn't really know how to handle the State Department, and I don't know if any woman would have been able to do it. She was a self-made woman. She'd come from Massachusetts and really from mill work. So she was in a different milieu than she was used to. But so I'm not sure, Michael, what your question is in terms, was like he the best person to be in charge at this time? If that's your question, I'd say no.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems to me that he made comments that I've seen in the documents that could be described as strongly prejudiced against what he understood Iran to be. And I just wonder whether that prejudice played into his role in organizing the coup in 1953.
Absolutely. Yes. I found him as just such a strange person when I was researching this. And one story that really stuck, and I'll get back more directly to your comment, but one story that really stuck with me is that, you know, he was in Basel when Lenin was there, and Lenin phoned him and said he wanted to meet with him. And Dulles said, well, I'm going to go play, you know, he said, I don't have time to see you. And what he was doing was going to play tennis. And then Lenin gets on the train and goes to Russia and starts the revolution. And what really bothers me about that story is that Dulles repeated it again and again and again as a funny story. And you know, and then when he was in Constantinople, he was newly married. His brother-in-law committed suicide in the US. His wife was unhappy. They leave Turkey. Don't think he had a good experience in this Middle Eastern country, as Turkey would be considered at the time. I don't think he knew very much, except he knew some people in oil. And I think that's why he gets appointed to this area. But yeah, I think that whole thing in 53 is just a disaster. And the CIA has a lot to explain about that.
Well, I mean, just to build on Michael's question, Alan Dulles, I believe at that time was head of the Bureau of Near East Affairs at the State Department. Yes. When Imbrie got appointed. And didn't we see some documents that Dulles was very impressed with Imbrie's anti-Bolshevik attitudes and how Imbrie is so anti-Bolsheviks and he's ready to do anything to Bolsheviks. And that kind of appealed to Dulles, who also himself felt the world is under threat by communism and all that. So it wasn't so much the personality maybe, but the fact that ideologically, there could be more connections between Allen Dulles and Imbrie in terms of how they both saw their mission. And maybe one reason they appointed them to Persia was to go after Russians.
That, in fact, is how I read the documents, that he had been an intelligence agent in Vyborg. He was sent to Istanbul to work with White Russian forces fighting against the Bolsheviks. And when he was assigned to Tabriz, the implication is that he was going to be running information contacts into the Soviet Union from Tabriz. And so my conclusion is that he was essentially an agent of Dulles, although this was not in the CIA, which didn't exist, it was in the State Department.
Right. And also, I think from Iran, some of the Iranian historians who have focused on the area do see that connection of Dulles. And as you mentioned, to the coup again. So it is interesting to me that when you read the Persian materials on the coup, Iranian historians always mention the connections of Dulles to Imbrie in order to bring people up in terms of history of United States interference in Iran.
Yeah, and I didn't go into that in my presentation, but the State Department, when the time Imbrie is in Russia through to the end, the State Department is so anti-Bolshevik, and that's why we don't recognize the government until 1933.
Oh, yes.
And, even though we have trade agreements moving forward and so on, the people of the State Department are dug in against Bolshevism and communism. And then that comes out really strongly with the immigration law of 1924, where they wanted to be sure that Russians can't, and not too many can come to the US because they might bring Bolshevik ideas, even though most of these people would be fleeing Bolshevism at that time.
Yeah.
But which really affects world history, that law. And so, yes, I agree, but I don't think it was just Dulles. I think it was a strong anti-Bolshevist view in the State Department.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Sue. I think we managed to really look at how Imbrie's death really changed the story of American-Iranian relations and how important it is also in the story of American-Iranian relations, and still has reverberations today as Iran and United States on a conflict path are still trying to kind of find a way to understand each other, to put it very diplomatically. So I really encourage every member of our audience and the members to really read this excellent book, published by University of Nebraska Press. We have sent an email, I think earlier, we will share it again, that should you be interested, there is a discount code for you. And for many others, there's also audio version that we can always enjoy. And with that, I want to thank you, Sue, and we look forward to have you in our future events.
Thank you.